Randy, going through the process, getting nominated to run for mayor, you went through the caucus process of interviews. Can you take our listeners through that process? Not necessarily the questioning, but there's a whole slate of candidates that the caucus puts forward, and they go through a rigorous process. If you can just talk to that.
Sure. So my experience with the caucus has always been on the candidate side. So you had Joe Aridi on a week ago, and I think he gave a pretty in-depth description of the mechanics of the caucus and how it works at the ground, at the grassroots level. My experience has always been as somebody who has been asked to interview for a position. So I think maybe I'll start by going to how I got involved in the process as an alderman. It was from a friend of mine in the community who knew me well, who was involved in the third ward nominating process, who said, "Hey, we're in the process of looking for a new candidate for city council. Would you be willing to interview?" And at the time I was, fully into my career, and I hadn't given it too much thought, but my father had done this in the village of Glen Ellen. He was what they call a trustee, and he enjoyed it. And so when I was asked, I thought this would be interesting. So I went and I interviewed. And after the first interview, apparently it went well. They asked me for a second interview. It went well. And the next thing you know, I was nominated. So fast forward, I was alderman for 6 years. And then at the end of my term as an alderman, a representative from the caucus reached out to me and asked me again if I would agree to interview for the position of mayor. I really enjoyed my time as an alderman. And so I thought sure, I would be happy to do that if I'm honored that they asked me. So the process, as it was then and as it still is, they invite you to an interview. You spend an hour with 10 to 12 people, I think it is. Might be less. I don't remember the exact number. And it varied a little bit from interview to interview. They would ask a series of questions that my understanding is that they asked all of the candidates for that position essentially the same questions. Maybe some follow-up questions were different depending on your answers. With each cycle, they would meet afterwards, discuss the candidates' responses, and move certain people forward. So my first experience running for mayor through the caucus system, I made it to the final round. There were 3 finalists at that time. It was myself, George Pandaleon, and Kathy Waldeck. The 3 of us appeared in front of the caucus committee, 43 people. They asked questions again, and we weren't all there together. So you're not really running against somebody else within the caucus. You are simply being interviewed for a position. So it's not like a campaign or even like it is now. I wasn't running against Kathy Waldeck. I wasn't running against George Pandaleon. I was simply presenting myself as a candidate for their possible selection. And at that time, they looked at the 3 of us and they chose George, which was not illogical. I mean, he had tremendous experience. He was a great alderman. George moved forward and he was the unopposed candidate for mayor. What I can say about that process not having been selected, it was fine. I mean, I felt like it was a great process. I was treated fairly, and I thought George was a great candidate. And I actually happened to think that for that time, they made the proper decision. So I called him up and said, George, congratulations, you'll be great. If you need me, you know where I live. And that's how that went. Then fast forward now 4 more years. I was called by David Hunt, president of the caucus, and asked if I would consider interviewing for mayor again. So we had a discussion about what the caucus was thinking, et cetera. And, there'd been a lot of community chatter, which you guys have discussed quite a bit, about what the caucus was doing and what they were thinking. And my concern going into it was simply this. I just wanted to make sure that if I entered the process, that it was a merit-based process. I didn't want to get into something where there was a preconceived notion of what the candidate would need to look like or sound like. And so he assured me that that was the case. and I participated. And again, the process was really unchanged from those processes that I'd been through before, which is one of the beauties of the caucus, right? They're always looking at the same kinds of things. They're looking for nonpartisan, non-agenda based candidates who have life experiences that are applicable to city government. And I think that's what you want. And the other beauty of it is that every time you interview, it's completely different people. So like when I interviewed for mayor the first time, none of those people were left when I interviewed the second time. So there wasn't any carryover, there wasn't any bias, there wasn't any of that. Going through the process this time, again, 3 different rounds of questioning. The only difference this time was that there were only 2 finalists for some reason. I don't really know why. On this occasion, the caucus decided that for this time, I was the best candidate, and therefore they put me forward as their nominee, and the rest is history.
I think one of the important aspects that you mentioned, Randy, was you didn't roll out of bed saying, I want to be alderman or I want to be mayor. And this is typical of the caucus process that people don't really understand, is that there are people in the community going to the caucus committee saying, hey, look at this person or interview this person. And I think that's the unique process of it, is it's really not, I want to be alderman, I want to do this. It's other people in the community, identifying somebody and saying, hey, caucus committee, go talk to this person.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that's really a great way to do it, right? Because what's the alternative? The alternative is people essentially nominating themselves and going out and finding like-minded people who want to support them to do something. And that always requires some form of underlying agenda. There's some reason why you believe that you are the person who should be X, right? Whereas the caucus just looks for qualified people with appropriate skill sets and then screens them. And I think that's, for the type of government that we have, I think that's really what you want. I mean, I believe that it's an extremely strong system and essential to our form of government.